Sunday, Monday, happy days. Tuesday, Wednesday, happy days. Thursday, Friday, happy days. The weekend comes, my cycle hums, ready to race to you.
Welcome everyone to episode 5 of Floppy Days, the American Computer Museum. I'm going to do things a little bit differently with this podcast. I had mentioned in the previous podcast that I was traveling to Montana, and while there I was going to visit a place that's special to me called the American Computer Museum and do an interview with the director of that museum. Once I did that, and I had some other things that I wanted to talk about on this podcast as well, I decided I would just make an entire 50-minute podcast on the American Computer Museum. My next podcast, as I had originally planned, will be on the Commodore PET, and that will occur in July. I thought I would really change things up with this podcast, do a few things that I've not had a chance to do. One is to cover some news in the vintage computer industry that's going on. Talk about some of the upcoming shows that's happening later this year. Also thought I would talk about any additions to my vintage computer collection and cover some listener feedback before I get into the main topic, which again is the American Computer Museum. First up, I want to mention that there is a new podcast I'm working in conjunction with Kevin Savitz and Brad Arnold. Kevin you may be familiar with as the author of the book Terrible Nerd, and also has put together the AtariArchives.org site, which has many computer magazines and books. Brad Arnold, who is president of the Atlanta Historical Computing Society, is also involved as well. So we started up a podcast on the Atari 8-bit line of computers. It's called Antic, and it is a monthly podcast. We would certainly be happy to have you listen to that as well, if you have any interest at all in learning more about the Atari 8-bit computer line. Also, Earl Evans, a very prolific podcaster that I'm sure all of you are aware of, has created some more podcasts. The first one I want to mention is called Next Without 4, and is a podcast concerning vintage programming, which is sorely needed, something that isn't out there and no one else has done. He's already had one podcast on DBase 3, but it's dedicated to computer language implementations that are either retro or new but used for retro computers. For instance, Turbo Pascal, CC65, etc. And again, that will be a monthly podcast, and it's part of the RetroBits family of podcasts. Earl has another podcast that he put out as well, and that has to do with the Commodore computer line. It's called Chicken Lips Radio. It's not yet on iTunes, but he has put out the first podcast, and it's called Why I Love Commodore. It's dedicated to Commodore retro computing, and he's planning on covering the machines, history, and exciting developments happening today in both hardware and software around the Commodore computers. Next, I want to talk about some upcoming shows. I am very much interested in retro computing shows. I have gone to at least one for each of the last 3 years, typically the Vintage Computer Festival Midwest in Chicago. I also recently went to the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast that was held in Atlanta a few months ago. And I find them very fun events, very interesting events, and I would certainly encourage anyone to try to go to these. One that's coming up is in just a couple weeks as of this podcast, is the Kansas Fest, which is held July 23rd through the 28th. Now, this is one that I have never gotten to. I would certainly like to one day. It's strictly an Apple event. It's held in Kansas City, Missouri, and it's the world's only annual convention dedicated to the Apple II computer. They invite hobbyists, retro computing enthusiasts, and diehard aficionados to gather from all corners of the world. And I understand they do get a lot of people from all over the world. It's, as I said, it's a 5 to 6 day event, and I've never gone, but I certainly intend to go one day. Another event that is happening this year is the 2013 Commodore Vegas Expo. Again, as of this podcast, it's only 2 to 3 weeks away, but this one is held July 27th through the 28th at the Plaza Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. This year's theme is the Commodore SX 64, and those of you that don't know, that is a luggable Commodore 64 that there are some real enthusiasts that love the SX64. But it's similar to the compact line of computers. Like I said, it's a luggable machine. It'd be a stretch to call it portable. But at this show, you can meet other Commodore and Amiga enthusiasts. You can see demos and presentations on and about the Commodore 128, the 64, the VIC-20, the PET, the Amiga, and other Commodore machines. You can present your own Commodore projects or find those hard-to-find goodies at the vendor tables. So again, that's July 27th through the 28th in Las Vegas. This one I just mentioned, the Vintage Computer Festival Midwest. Again, I've been to the last 3. This is version 8.0. It will be held September 28th through the 29th in Lombard, Illinois. Illinois, not Illinois. There will be talks, a vendor area, and lots of vintage machine displays. I've gone for the last 3 years, and I have t-shirts to prove it. There's always a large Commodore and Coco presence. There are local Commodore and Coco groups in Chicago. Chicago seems to be a real hotbed of vintage computers. And both of those groups always have a really great showing at this particular festival. There's also a loyal group of TI aficionados. That's the TI 99 in Chicago. And they have the 2013 Chicago TI International World Fair going on. That will be the weekend of November 2nd in Evanston, Illinois. The fair runs from 9:30 a.m. until 5 p.m. This is the 31st show. And following the fair, there will be a banquet at a local restaurant where the John Birdwell Award will be presented. There will be a jury of volunteers to evaluate various TI websites, and there is an award that's given to this year's recipient. Again, being in Indianapolis, Chicago is close to me, so I like the fact that there are so many events going on in Chicago. But this is one I've not gotten to, and I certainly would like to, and I may try to go this year. Next, I wanted to get into some customer feedback. I've gotten several emails in particular since I've started this podcast, and I thought I'd use this podcast as an opportunity to go through some of those and talk about some of the feedback I've gotten. One email I got is from a gentleman named Jonathan Katz, and it's a little exciting to me because this is something happening in Indiana. I guess Jonathan is trying to start up an Indiana computer museum with hands-on exhibits to teach the public about computer history. He has a Facebook page that you can go to, which I'll have in the show notes. And he currently, as of this podcast, has an Indiegogo campaign going on to raise funds to start this museum. I guess he needs some funds to get a location established, and I think he's trying to get enough money to really fund the first year of operation. So take a look at the links that I provide in the show notes, and if you have any interest at all in this, give Jonathan some help. I received an email from Stephen Wyrick, who is well known in the Apple II circles. He has the Apple II History website at apple2history.org. And he is also the author of Sophistication and Simplicity, The Life and Times of the Apple II Computer. This book is not out quite yet. It can be pre-ordered on Amazon, and I do plan to order it just as soon as it's available. I may even pre-order it. Stephen was good enough to send me an email and said, I enjoy the show and in the process of listening to the Apple I episode, which I did actually in my last episode. Thanks for doing the show. Whenever you get to any model of the Apple II series, whether you do each model separately or do them all as a bunch, feel free to email if you have any questions about the story or stories. And he also agreed to be interviewed when I get to the Apple II for this podcast. So, Stephen, thank you very much for the offer. I certainly will take you up for that, take you up. Concerning that, I know when I get to the point of doing the Apple II show, there's going to be so much stuff to cover that having someone help me wade through some of the information is going to definitely be helpful, and especially an expert like yourself. I also received an email from someone named Eric, who said, "Hello, Randy. I just wanted to tell you that your latest podcast auto-downloaded to my phone. I just listened to the Apple I show and did enjoy it a lot. I can't wait for the Atari show. I never had an Atari, but I had friends that did. Like I am today, I was very cross-platform and loved computers more than I loved brands. The summer of '84, I had saved up $200 and came home with a Commodore 64. I love them all, but Commodore still has a special place in my heart. Thanks again for all your work. It's enjoyed. Signed, Eric." Eric, thank you very much for the email. I appreciate it. I appreciate all contacts. And like you, I'm very computer agnostic. I love all the vintage computers. I might have just a little extra special place in my heart for the Atari 8-bit line, but I really enjoy all of them. And if you look at my collection, you can see that that's the case because I have a pretty large and eclectic collection. I received another email from Rick Otto, who has a site called My Tech Brief. My Tech Brief is a fairly new site in which he has started a vintage computer section. Now, he wrote me a very long, involved email, which I shortened greatly for this podcast, but I thought I'd just read some of that email. "Good job on the latest podcast. I never knew much about the Apple I, but I learned more about it. I actually ordered one of the 3 books you mentioned. I think it's the one called Fire in the Valley. For my tech brief, I'm working on some ideas for vintage computing articles now. When I have time to start playing around with some of these vintage computers I purchased on eBay, I'm going to start writing some other articles that are based on my experiences with them. Well, I know that doing a podcast must be a lot of work, so I want to give you some encouragement and say great job. Hope you're enjoying building your collection. I may even look at a TRS-80. If I do look for one, though, I will try to get to the Color Computer 3. I had gotten a lot of vintage computing equipment a couple months ago, but I'm taking a quick break until I get back to it next week. My next items should be a Commodore 128, a Mac SE30, and an Amiga 3000 or 4000. Again, thanks for the wonderful podcast." Rick, thank you very much for your email. I think you're going to enjoy the book, Fire in the Valley. It's a very large, very comprehensive book. As far as your collection, the Color Computer 3 is a wonderful machine, which I have. I have a Coco 3 and a Coco 2. And good luck getting some of the other items that you talked about getting. The Commodore 128, I have one of those. Mac SE30, I don't. And I don't have an Amiga yet, although I certainly would like to get one day. That is one of the machines that, although I was an Atari person basically back in the day, and I had both the 8-bit and the 16-bit Atari ST computer, I always wondered what the Amiga was like and would like to learn more about it, so I'll probably get an Amiga 500 one day. Good luck with your website, My Tech Brief, and looking forward to seeing some other vintage computer articles out there. That's it for the listener feedback. I thought next I would cover some of the new acquisitions I've gotten for my collection. I have gotten a couple things since the last podcast. The first of which is a book called, it's on the TRS-80 and it's called More Than Basic. So this is the TRS-80 Model 1, Model 3, basically. And it's a very nice book. I have a huge collection of books on all of the computers, and basically I'm at the point in my collecting where I'm more likely to collect books than I am additional hardware, although you're going to find that I have gotten some additional hardware since the last show that I'll talk about here in a minute. But I really intend to grow my book collection as much as possible and get as many vintage computer books in my collection as possible. One of the computers that I did get since the last show, hardware-wise, is a PC Junior. I've got to tell you the story about this one. I've always wanted a PC Junior. That really is the only representation or representative device of the old IBM compatible computers that I really want to own. I had a lot of the older machines, the IBM compatible machines, but in my view, the old IBM compatibles really kind of ruined the personal computer industry, because prior to the IBM personal computer, there was such a variety of computers, such a large variety, and I thought that was great. So, I'm not disparaging the IBM compatibles, but I really like the days when there were a lot of different brands of computers and not just the IBM compatibles. Anyway, PC Junior is one that I always did want, just because it was targeted at the home computer industry. It was a smaller machine, and it's just something I always wanted to own. So I have scoured for a long time for a PC Junior. They come up on eBay. They really usually don't go for a lot of money. But normally when I look for things on eBay, the first thing I do in one of my searches is to look for things that are close, that are within a 75-mile range of my home near Indianapolis. And that way I can typically get things cheaper. I'm more likely to win them because I don't have to pay shipping. Of course, I will normally contact the seller and make sure that they're good with doing local pickup, and they aren't always, but most of the time they are. So in this case, there was a PC Junior that came up in the Indianapolis area, and it was going pretty inexpensively, which was right down my alley, and it was a tested working machine, and it had basically everything you need to start out with a PC Junior. 64K, had the manuals, it was tested, had the IR keyboard, it had the basic cartridge. So I bid on it. It was, like I said, it wasn't going very high, and I won it for $32, which I thought was great. I thought, wow, this is wonderful. That's a very low cost way for me to get in and learn more about the PC Junior. So I sent an email to the gentleman, or to the person on eBay, saying that I would be picking this up and to get directions to his or her house. And I received an email back which he signed with his name, and I recognized that name. It was somebody that I knew from the place that I work, which is a company called Fusion Alliance, based in Indianapolis. So I contacted him and I said, is this the person I know that works at Fusion Alliance? And sure enough, it turned out to be him. So that was pretty incredible. This turned out to be the first machine that he owned. He's a little bit younger than I am. So it was the first machine that he owned, the one he grew up with, and his parents wanted to get it out of the house. So he put it up on eBay to be sold. So he took it into work, put it under my desk at work, and I got him the money, and I now have a PC Junior sitting on my desk, which I'm anxious to dig into when I get a chance and learn more about. The other item that actually is not in my possession yet, but which I did win on eBay, is an Atari 810 disk drive. And I will talk about this likely more on the Atari podcast, on our next Atari podcast. But I've wanted an 810 for quite a while. I have a 1050. I have many of the Atari 8-bit machines. But it's difficult to find an 810 that's in great shape and that's tested and that I can feel comfortable that I'll get it and it'll work. This one was listed as tested, the head had been cleaned, and the speed had been adjusted to factory specs. It included a cover, the power supply, SIO cable, manuals, master diskettes, and the original outer box. Also included the DOS 2, 2.5, and 3.0 diskettes, the DOS 3 reference manual, and some 3 boxes of blank diskettes. So it included a ton of stuff. It was tested and adjusted and had everything that was needed. So I bid on this. It actually went for a pretty reasonable price, and I won the auction, so I'm just waiting for it to come in. So I may talk about it a little bit on one of my next shows or on the podcast I end up doing on the Atari. But I can't wait for that to come in and play with that a little bit. That's it as far as new acquisitions to my collection. So now I'm going to get into the primary topic of this show, which is the American Computer Museum. I've mentioned in the past that my family and I lived in Montana for 2 years, about 10 years ago. Prior to that, we used to take trips to visit various parts of Montana, looking for land to purchase so that we could move there one day. So this was, maybe about 15 years ago when we were doing this, and we looked all over the West, and Montana was really the place that we ended up selecting. One of our very first trips to Montana was to Bozeman. Bozeman is in the west central portion of Montana, in the Rocky Mountains. Those of you that have been to Montana may or may not know that the eastern part of Montana is fairly flat. There aren't a lot of mountains there. But once you get to the central portion, that's really where the Rocky Mountains start. And Bozeman is right there in the middle of it. It's a beautiful city located in a valley surrounded by mountains. It's also considered the technological capital of the state, with a university, Montana State, and several technology companies located there. As we were visiting, I stumbled upon the American Computer Museum, and having lived through the early home computer years, I decided to visit the museum. It brought back some great memories. At that time, it was located in an older building in an out-of-way location, and it wasn't very impressive on the outside. However, on the inside were many of the computers I remember from several years back. There were mainframes, mini computers, and some of my favorites, the personal computers and handheld calculators. I finally recalled all of the personal computers that had been available during the late 70s through the 80s, and they had examples of all of them in this museum. I remember taking my daughter through the museum. She was about 11 or 12 at the time, and talking to her about my memories of many of the computers. Fast forward to the present. In that time, we lived in Montana and moved back to Indiana. We visited and still visit Montana every 3 to 4 years, and every time I do, I make sure to make it a priority to visit the American Computer Museum. It's moved locations a couple of times in that span, but I always found it and always visited. And I always thought about those computers some of which I had owned in the day, and others which I didn't have the means to own at the time, but had always wondered what they were like to use. Finally, I decided one day to check out eBay and see if any of those computers were still out there and if they could be purchased. I was afraid that if any of them did exist, they would be too expensive to start collecting. So you can imagine my delight when I found that not only did every machine I had ever heard of, and some I hadn't, was available on eBay, many of them were available for reasonable prices. I think the first machine I ordered was an in-the-box VIC-20, and I was hooked from there. As you can tell from the collection that I have today, I credit the American Computer Museum with rekindling my interest in vintage computers and starting me on my way to collecting. Now, I'll give you a little bit of history of the museum first of all. It was founded in May 1990 by Barbara and George Keremedjiev as a nonprofit organization. Originally, they were going to locate it in Princeton, New Jersey, but they changed the location when they decided to move to Bozeman, Montana. They had decided that they wanted to live in and near nature, and Bozeman was a terrific place to live. So they opened the computer museum there. It's considered the oldest extant museum dedicated to the history of computers in the world. In other words, it's the oldest one that's still open. The Computer Museum in Boston opened first, but it closed in 1999. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the interview itself. So before I get into the interview, I want to talk about the events leading up to the interview itself, because I found it rather interesting, and I thought maybe you would too. I contacted George well before George being George Keremedjiev, well before we were to visit Montana, to tell him the dates I would be in Bozeman and ask whether he would have a few minutes for an interview. I had always wanted to meet the person who had started the museum, and the podcast that I'm doing, Floppy Days, was the excuse that I needed. So that gave me the courage to contact him, and he was kind enough to agree to come into the museum that day in order to talk with me, because as it turned out, based on our schedule, I was only going to be in Bozeman one full day, and so that was the only time I had to meet with him. So we set up a time to get together, which he later had to amend because he had been invited to speak to a group that morning. So he was able to still meet me that day, but it was going to be later in the day, and I was more than happy to meet him on his schedule. When I went to the museum that day, I was a little bit early. I was a little nervous, in fact, because I haven't done a lot of interviews and I was going to be doing this one in person. So I was a little bit early and he was running a little late. And of course, being there, I wanted to walk through the museum and see what it looked like. Today, I hadn't been there in 3 years. So I walked through the museum, which had expanded since the last time I'd been there to double its previous size, and also now included robotics. In fact, robotics is now in the name. It actually is the American Computer and Robotics Museum. But all of the personal computer items were there that I remembered, the difference being that now I own many of those items myself, that being the personal computer variety. He also has some larger machines that, of course, I don't own. One notable exception, of course, is the Apple I computer. I certainly don't own one. And if I did, with the prices they're fetching today, I don't know how long I could hang on to it. I noticed that he had an Apple I on display there, and I do recall in the past he had as well, but because of the recent news surrounding Apple I's, it really caught my eye that he had this Apple I on display there. And not only that, it's signed by Steve Wozniak and was donated by the man himself. The other thing that impressed me about it is that it includes all of the original documentation and some other items, along with it as well. It's a very impressive display. I took a lot of pictures while I was in the museum, and I'll make those available in the show notes. When I finished my tour of the museum, I went up front and talked with a very nice lady who was greeting everyone who came in and also was answering any questions that anyone might have. During our conversation, she received a phone call which she took. I couldn't help but overhear it as it was a quiet location, and it was clear the person on the other end of the phone line was from Forbes magazine, asking to speak with George. It turned out there was an Apple I coming up for auction. Remember, this was in late June of this year, and they wanted some quotes from George concerning the auction. Apparently, they were on a very tight schedule and needed him to call back right away. When George did come in a few minutes later, he apologized and said he needed to make a call. He was gone a few minutes, and then we conducted the interview. The point of that story is that it's obvious that George is highly respected when it comes to computer history. I did a web search later because I was curious and came across the article in Forbes in which George was quoted. I'm including a link to the article in the show notes, but I thought I would read a little bit of the article, at least those pieces that talk about George. Do the words vintage and tech strung together strike anyone as odd? Well, better get used to the phrase because the vintage tech market is here to stay. As boomers have more money to spend on their past, they are buying up these products as investments, said George Keremedjiev, director of the American Computer and Robotics Museum in Bozeman, Montana. Now, Keremedjiev notes, it's the non-techies too who are drawn to the Apple I. Over the past 5 years, as auctions started to drive prices up, it's been interesting to watch the Apple I go from about $20,000 to the astronomical prices they command today. So that is a telling of the events leading up to the interview. Next, I will actually play the interview that I had with George Keremedjiev, director of the American Computer and Robotics Museum in Bozeman, Montana. I'm here with George Keremedjiev of the American Computer Museum, and I wanted to spend a few minutes with George. He was kind enough to agree to talk with me a little bit about the history of the museum. George, can you talk a little bit about how the museum got started?
Well, the museum started as a private collection. I got hooked on the collecting of adding machines, of all things, back in 1980, and we lived in Princeton, New Jersey at the time. And as the collection grew, it took over the living room, the upstairs, the downstairs, and we had to make a decision, what would we do with all these things? And at the same time, I wanted to find a place to live where I could, with my wife, raise our two then young children with nature. New Jersey, Princeton, where we were living, was the original location for the museum. That was the planned location. And so I scouted the West and found Bozeman to be extremely pleasant. I automate factories for a living. I don't make any money in the museum, neither does my wife. It's a true nonprofit in all senses of the term. And so my clients don't care where I live. I work with various manufacturers in the automotive, medical, electronics sector. And Bozeman has worked out beautifully for the museum because of the tourism between Yellowstone and Glacier National Park. So we have tourists from all over the world. And at first, the question always is, well, why is it here? To which I always say, well, why not? We have just as much technology in Bozeman today as any part of the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. There was a time when Bozeman lagged behind, like most small towns, but not anymore. We have just about everything that you could find in Chicago, Denver, New York. And the caliber of our visitors is extremely high. Many of them are technology folks who are vacationing at Yellowstone. And after 3-4 days of buffalo and geyser, they start looking at what else is there to do around here. Right. And we get quite a few of those that come here totally surprised that there's a museum like this.
Okay, well, you answered my question. I wondered why it was in Bozeman. But it is a great area, and as I mentioned to you, I come here as often as I can when I get out here. And you're close to the other museums here as well, right?
Exactly. The Museum of the Rockies, a spectacular paleontology museum, is half a mile away, right off of the main road, Kagi, as we are. And there's a really nice Western History Museum downtown, the Gallatin County Museum. And the three museums work together. We occasionally have programs and joint tickets over the years, joint advertising. But we do not compete because we have three different spheres that we cover. Ours is technology, Museum of the Rockies is nature, and the Pioneer Museum, the history of the West.
Okay. I know you've had a lot of famous people here at the museum. I wonder if maybe you could focus on that a little bit, some of the famous guests that you've had here?
Yeah, one of the funniest stories was back in 1994. The phone rang, and the fella on the other end said, "This is Buzz Aldrin. I'd like to come and visit with my family." And of course, I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was a crank call, the second man to walk in the moon. What's he doing here in Bozeman? And he walks with his wife and some friends and family. Turns out his cousin lives here in Bozeman, so he was visiting with her and found out about us and came for a visit. And he was wonderful. He told me many stories about the preparations he had to navigate from the moon back to Earth with a slide rule should the navigation computer aboard the command module malfunction. But his major at MIT was celestial navigation, so for him this was perfectly doable. And on top of that, we've had now for quite a few years the original Apollo moon mission navigation computer on loan from the Air and Space Museum. And we also have a watch that was worn on the moon by Dave Scott, commander of Apollo 15. So his visit with those artifacts on display was really exciting for us. Mm-hmm. And over the years, we've had a series of awards where we honor living pioneers of computing and communications. And lately, we've launched another award to honor those who use technology for the enhancement of biodiversity. So the Computer and Communications Award is the George R. Stibitz Award, and the Biodiversity Award is the Edward O. Wilson Award. And over the years, we've had such folks as Jack Kilby, who invented the microchip, Marty Cooper, who invented the cell phone, Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple Computer. We've had names that most everyone has not heard of, such as Ralph Baer, but he's the father of video games. Everyone knows video games, but Ralph is not as known as he should be. And so we've had about 40 individuals of that caliber here over the years. And again, the main purpose is to flesh out, surface the personalities behind the inventions.
That's amazing. I know you've got a lot of really neat exhibits here. I know the last time I was here, you've expanded since then. It appears also that you've expanded into robotics. I don't recall that being the case the last time I was here. Can you talk about some of the famous exhibits you have here and then why your expansion into robotics?
Well, this whole concept of humanoid social robots has captivated me for many years. These are robots that are primarily being developed in Japan because they have such a large population of elderly and not enough young people to take care of them. So they've developed robots to be companions to the elderly. And last winter, I decided that it sure would be neat if we had an exhibit showcasing how artificial intelligence is being built into robotics, because it's the same situation in our country here, where we have a tremendous amount of baby boomers retiring, and it would be just as beneficial to have social robotics here. So in the process, the exhibit just grew and grew and now incorporates the history of robotics and science fiction, social robotics, of course, and then an exhibit on artificial and natural intelligence, where we compare brains of different animals, including a human brain, an actual human brain, with the architecture of a computer. We have hands-on displays coming up within the next 3 months on robotics for young people. And we also have a small 2.5-foot tall robotic humanoid that we demonstrate to the public.
What about in the area of personal computers? I know a lot of my listeners are interested in personal computers, home computers from the specifically the late 70s to mid 80s. Can you talk a little bit about what you have here in that regard?
Yeah, we have an Apple I computer that was given to us by Steve Wozniak, the inventor of the Apple I and the Apple II. But we also have the entire series of the more famous computers that were based on the Intel chip. So we have the Altair, the IMSI, we have a whole slew of Commodores, such as the VIC-20, the VIC-64, the Commodore 64. We have the original Popular Electronics from January 1975 announcing the first successful personal computer, the Altair. And our copy is signed by Bill Gates, Paul Allen, and Monty Davidoff, the three individuals that did the programming, as well as with Ed Roberts, who invented the Altair.
Wow.
So the PC era, I believe, is interestingly covered. We have hundreds of PCs in the collection, and of that, we cherry-picked the 50 or so most famous ones that people could relate to who are old enough to remember these early machines.
Right.
But the entire museum only shows about 6% of the collection. We have a huge storage facility. We actually would very much welcome the ability to have 20,000 square feet because we have these large mainframe computers, including a 1956 Burroughs vacuum tube system. It's this huge machine with all kinds of peripherals, and it's quite a famous computer because one just like it was used in several science fiction movies in the 50s and 60s. So that would be our next step, would be to find a large space where we can place a modern iPhone on a nice stand in front of this enormous room-sized vacuum tube system and contrast the two for the visitor.
Sure. Yeah. For the listeners out there, what could they do to help this museum? Do you need equipment? Do you need labor? Do you need donations? I mean, what could they do most to help you?
Well, like all nonprofits, we would first and foremost welcome any financial donations on our webpage, compustory.com. We have a link to PayPal for nonprofit donations, and any such donations are, of course, tax deductible per your listeners' federal and state laws. But also, if they happen to have any unusual PC equipment, prototypes, any kind of wire-wrapped early experimental machines from the 70s in particular, we're always on the lookout for that because most of that has been thrown away. We don't need any more Kaypros or Osbornes or any of the better-known systems. We have enough of those. But anything unusual, prototype type of computing would be very interesting to us. And, of course, anything with vacuum tube technology would be very much welcomed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, George. I really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy. I hope that the listeners out there get a chance to visit this museum. It really is great, and I come here as often as I can. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you for yours, and you're very welcome.
Okay, that's the interview, and that's the show. I want to thank you for listening. Again, the next podcast will be on the Commodore PET. That will come out in August. I'm really trying to stay on a monthly schedule. That's one of the reasons I decided to go with the Computing Museum as the podcast for July, because of the 2-week vacation that I took. I really didn't have time to put together the podcast on the Commodore PET. So I expanded the show about the computer museum to fill up an entire show. And I'll get back on the regular schedule the next time as far as the regular topic. So that's pretty much it. Again, this is the Floppy Days podcast. We welcome your feedback, or I welcome your feedback very much. I really appreciate it when I receive an email or get a tweet, or leave a voicemail for me. I love to get those as well. I don't get very many of those. People don't seem to like to use the voicemail. But you can go to my website, floppydays.libsyn.com. That's floppydays.libsyn.com. Send me an email at floppydays@gmail.com. The Twitter account is @floppydays. And I will speak to you again next month. Thank you.